Areva Martin is a legal affairs commentator and civil rights attorney. And Jennifer Horn is the host of the Morning Answer on 870 AM here in Los Angeles. Ladies, welcome back. Good to see both of you back together again.
Yes.
Let's start with the attorney here on the panel. Areva, what kind of legal challenges is Eric Swalwell looking at now?
Well, both criminal and civil. We already know that the district attorney in Manhattan and Alameda County have both announced that they are opening investigations because one of the allegations is that some sexual assault took place in Manhattan in 2024, and there's a possibility that some of these allegations relate to incidents that occurred in Alameda County back in 2019. So he is facing the potential of some very serious charges if these allegations prove to be true. And then let's not forget about civil charges. So even if they're not criminal charges brought and upheld in a court of law, he could still face civil charges because these women apparently were his employees at some point. They were former staffers. So there are strict laws, civil laws against discrimination, sexual harassment in the workplace. And then we have this cease and desist letter, which could be seen as some kind of obstruction of justice, some effort to influence these witnesses and to prevent them from coming forward. So I think the legal jeopardy is pretty clear.
And one of the reasons that he may have resigned is that the House Ethics Committee hearing about him stops because they don't look at former members of Congress. And if that committee would have gone to work and started collecting documents, those documents could have been used in any of those cases that you just talked about. That could have been discovery for those cases, which may have been a reason that he decided to get out. Also looked like he was going to lose this vote. And think about this, Jennifer, in terms of the dramatic drop-off. I mean, a week ago, he looked like he was the front runner to be the next governor of California. Now he's potentially looking at prison time.
Yeah, the Democrat machine had started to kick in behind Eric Swalwell. They were pushing him to the top, not because he had really any plans of his own, but because he was the loudest critic of Trump, which seems to matter most to California Democrats. But what I think is really interesting is that you not only saw the union support, you saw Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, and others pull their support and run very quickly away from Eric Swalwell. But I think the bigger issue is that this was a very poorly kept secret. People knew that these allegations were coming, and these were not Republican allegations. These were from Democrat circles. It was a poorly kept secret that he had all of this stuff behind him. And the fact that the unions, Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, and others decided that he was the appropriate person to endorse.
Pelosi did not endorse him.
Well, she told him to get out. That's for sure.
Pelosi told him to get out. She did not tell him to get in, didn't endorse him.
And that's a good thing.
But all the rest of them did. I mean, there was a long list, 21 members of Congress.
That's right.
No doubt about that. But we just heard the congressman from Arizona, his best friend, say that he led a double life. So it's not clear that these unions or these other Congress leaders or other elected officials knew about the conduct that he was. No, we have no evidence of that. There's no evidence that they knew that. Why would a union? Why would a Congress person?
They knew about the rumors.
Yeah, well, we all knew about the rumors. How did they not know?
The rumors are not credible.
Right.
And you cannot endorse or not endorse. There are rumors about Donald Trump. Come on, if we're going to talk about rumors, there are all kinds of rumors about him raping girls. There are rumors about him with Epstein. There are rumors about all kinds.
We don't have proof.
There are rumors. That's what we're saying. There's not proof. It's rumors.
Right.
So to indict those unions or to indict those Congress people on the basis of endorsements is not fair, because there are rumors about all kinds of elected officials, including those sitting in office.
I just don't know how you seriously endorse another candidate when you've already made the poor choice of endorsing Eric Swalwell. Because don't forget, whether or not this happens to pan out criminally, he was having staffers in his office sign NDAs. Now there's a DHS investigation.
He says they weren't.
And now there's a DHS investigation, not a rumor, because apparently he's being investigated for hiring an illegal immigrant to be his nanny and paying her with campaign funds. There were questions about whether or not he lived in the state of California. There were always questions about his finances. This guy has had a pretty dark history. To say that he has baggage is probably the nicest thing I could say.
I'm not going to sit here and try to defend Eric Swalwell. These allegations are really serious. I am a civil rights attorney. Any kind of accusations of sexual assault against victims, women, whether they're women or men, I take very seriously. And I think he did the right thing by resigning. I think criminal investigations should be opened up. But we also have to be clear. What happens to someone because of rumors in a political context does not impact what happens in a courtroom.
Right.
Due process, proving these allegations is what's going to happen in the courtroom. Very different standards, very different than the court of public opinion. The court of public opinion spoke, he resigned.
Right.
But he now will have an opportunity to present his case. And if these allegations are false, as he says they are, he will have an opportunity to prove that in the court of law.
Well, and that thing about rumors, some people are saying, well, why didn't you guys report it sooner? There is a process, a legal process of going through to vet claims to make sure that we are able to stand behind the claims of corroboration, to actually have victims come forward and go on the record, all those things. So yes, we had heard the rumors too, but we need to be able to back the story up before we go forward and report it, which we were able to do on Friday. And then within hours, we saw what happened to Eric Swalwell's career. Let's talk about President Trump, Jennifer. We just saw the attack on Pope Leo on social media, the picture of President Trump apparently as a doctor, who also, I guess, was a carpenter on the side.
Look, you can have multiple jobs.
Yeah.
It's all right.
What do you make of that? I mean, and
Trump.
And interesting that a lot of folks on the right are calling him out for this.
Yeah, look, I think the issue is actually separate from me. The picture is the picture. It's kind of internet garbage. I don't waste much time on that. He took it down. He apologized and moved on. He never apologizes, and he did in this case say he didn't want to offend anybody. But the thing with the Pope, I mean, he did say that.
That wasn't an apology to the Pope, Jennifer. Come on. Let's be
Well, no, he didn't apologize to the Pope, and I don't think he needs to, actually. Look, the Pope, just to set the stage, 12 years of Catholic school, born and raised Catholic. I have always had a problem when the Pope starts dipping their toes, whoever it is, whether it's Leo or someone else, into politics. Because let's be real, the Bible is filled with anecdotes of war. I would love to hear the Pope evenly apply pressure to the Iranian regime that killed 50,000 of its own people.
Oh, Jennifer.
He did put out a statement about. He did put out a statement.
When you start getting overtly political, then look, the Pope gets to say his piece, President Trump gets to say his piece, and I don't know that it's necessarily needs to blow up into an issue other than two leaders, one spiritual and one political, having a disagreement about what's appropriate.
Republicans are the ones also saying that this was horrible, this was blasphemy. They are as outraged as Democrats.
Maybe some of them are. I'm just talking
this
to you from
isn't
my
just a
perspective.
Democratic issue. This
And
is
my
I think this
perspective
is an American
political
issue.
Pope is unnecessary.
Well, it's not a political pope. He is the moral leader of 1.5 billion Catholics. He has a right to weigh in on the issue of war.
And
he's
so does
talking
President Trump. That's what I'm saying. He
President
gets
Trump
his
can
free
stand his
speech.
ground, but why did he take the post down? If he can stand his ground and
Well,
go
the
to
post
war
is
with the
different.
pope,
Two different things.
Yeah, the Post is different than the Pope's
go to war
comments.
with the Pope and see what happens in the Midwest with all those Catholics who voted for Trump in 2024, who broke for him.
I don't
So from a
necessarily
political
believe they're at
standpoint,
war
it
with
was an
one another.
incredibly non-cerebral thing to do.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time. I wish we could keep talking. Areva, Jennifer, great to see both of you. Thank you so much. We'll be back with more of The Story Is right after this.